300 German soldiers believed they had trapped 40 Americans in the frozen forests of Belgium. The outcome seemed inevitable: surrender or annihilation. But hidden among those 40 men was a rifleman who had spent his entire life mastering a different kind of battlefield, the mountains of Montana. For the next 6 hours, the Germans would learn that distance does not guarantee safety. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest in Belgium had turned into a maze of frozen roads, snow-covered trees, and low visibility. The German winter offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, had erupted with terrifying speed. Entire American units were being pushed back, cut off, or scattered across the forest. Somewhere along a narrow forest road, a small American patrol of roughly 40 soldiers was moving cautiously through the trees. Their orders were simple: scout the area and reconnect with another unit positioned deeper in the forest. But in the chaos of the German advance, simple orders rarely stayed simple. Within a few hours, distant gunfire began echoing through the trees. At first it sounded far away, but the sound grew closer, sharper, more organized. German infantry units were pushing through the forest from multiple directions. The patrol leader quickly realized something was wrong. Roads that should have been safe were suddenly blocked. The sounds of German voices carried through the woods. Footsteps moved in places where no American units were supposed to be. The patrol had walked straight into the path of a much larger German force. Retreat was no longer possible. The Americans quickly moved off the road and established a defensive position along a tree line overlooking a shallow depression in the forest floor. Fallen logs and scattered rocks offered minimal cover, but it was the best position they could find before the enemy closed in. Within an hour, the situation became painfully clear. German soldiers began appearing between the trees on multiple sides of the American position. Not dozens, but hundreds. The Germans were confident. They didn't rush the position immediately. Instead, they spread out through the forest, keeping their distance and slowly tightening the perimeter. From their perspective, there was no urgency. 40 trapped soldiers could not break through a force this large. Inside the American position, the mood shifted quickly. Ammunition was limited. Radio contact with their main unit had been lost. Every soldier could see movement through the trees as German troops maneuvered into better positions. The math was obvious. 40 men. Surrounded by hundreds. Some soldiers began conserving ammunition immediately, checking magazines and counting spare rounds. Others scanned the tree line, waiting for the moment when the Germans would finally decide to attack. But the Germans were patient. They kept their distance, well beyond what most infantry rifles were expected to hit with any real accuracy. From the German perspective, the Americans were already defeated. They simply didn't know it yet. What the German soldiers could not possibly know was that one of the Americans lying quietly behind a fallen tree had spent most of his life in the mountains of Montana. And in those mountains, distance never meant safety. Because when hunting elk across miles of open valley, one missed shot could mean losing the entire season. And the man behind that rifle had learned long ago that patience could be far deadlier than speed. Among the 40 Americans crouched behind fallen trees and scattered rocks was a soldier who barely spoke. He had arrived with the patrol like everyone else, carrying a Springfield rifle fitted with a scope that looked slightly different from the standard issue. To most of the men around him, it was just another rifle in a desperate situation. But the way he handled it was different. While others nervously watched the tree line, waiting for the Germans to attack, the rifleman lay motionless behind a thick fallen log. His breathing slowed. His movements became almost invisible. He wasn't watching the entire battlefield. He was studying it. Before the war, long before he had ever worn a uniform, He had spent years hunting in the mountains of Montana. The terrain there forced hunters to learn skills that few soldiers were ever taught. Distance could deceive the eye across open valleys. Wind could change direction between ridges. Animals could disappear in seconds if the shot was rushed. Success required patience. Hours of waiting. One perfect shot. Now, lying in the cold snow of the Ardennes Forest, those same lessons returned to him with surprising clarity. Through the scope, he began measuring the battlefield the way he once measured mountain valleys. Tree lines. Shadows. Movement. The German soldiers were confident enough to move between positions, occasionally stepping into small openings between the trees. They believed they were well outside effective rifle range. To most soldiers, they probably were. But the rifleman had spent years judging distance by instinct. He waited. Minutes passed. German voices echoed quietly through the woods. Then, one soldier stepped just a little too far into the open. The rifleman exhaled slowly. The rifle cracked once. The sound echoed sharply through the frozen forest. The German soldier collapsed instantly. For a moment, the woods fell silent. Several German soldiers turned, trying to understand what had happened. But the shot had come from far enough away that the exact position of the rifleman remained unclear. The Americans stayed quiet. No one fired. Minutes passed again. The rifleman didn't rush another shot. He simply watched. From the German side, the death looked strange. They had been keeping their distance specifically to avoid accurate rifle fire. At the ranges they were using, most American soldiers would struggle to hit anything reliably. Yet one of their men had just been dropped with a single shot. Then another German moved between two trees. Again the rifleman waited. Breathing steady. Finger resting lightly on the trigger. Another single crack split the forest. A second German soldier fell. Now confusion began spreading among the surrounding troops. The shots were too precise to be random. But they were too slow to come from a typical firefight. Minutes passed between them. From the German perspective, something unsettling was happening. Men standing in positions they believed were safe were suddenly collapsing without warning. And the forest itself gave no clear answer about where the danger was coming from. Behind the fallen log, the rifleman chambered another round calmly. He had no intention of firing quickly. He planned to do exactly what he had always done in the mountains. Wait. Watch. And shoot only when the moment was perfect. As the hours passed, the strange pattern of fire continued. There was no barrage of bullets. No frantic exchange of gunfire. Only a single rifle shot every few minutes. Then silence. From inside the American position, the soldiers began to notice the rhythm. At first, many of them had expected the Germans to launch a full assault at any moment. But the attack never came. Instead, the forest remained tense and quiet. Every so often, the sharp crack of the rifle would echo through the trees. And somewhere out in the snow-covered woods, another German soldier would fall. The rifleman never rushed. He stayed behind the same fallen tree, barely shifting position except to adjust the angle of his scope or steady his breathing. Each shot was deliberate, chosen only when a clear opportunity appeared. To the Americans watching from nearby positions, it slowly became clear what he was doing. He wasn't trying to stop the entire German force. He was shaping their behavior. Every time a soldier stepped into an opening or moved across a visible patch of ground, the risk suddenly became real. The Germans had assumed distance alone would keep them safe. But now distance meant nothing. Across the forest, German units began changing positions more cautiously. Soldiers moved slower, sticking close to thick tree cover. Some crawled through the snow instead of walking upright. Officers shouted orders as they tried to figure out where the shots were coming from. But the rifleman had chosen his position carefully. The fallen log shielded most of his body, and the dense forest broke up the sound of each shot, making it difficult to trace the exact origin. Minutes stretched into hours. The slow, methodical firing began to create something far more powerful than the bullets themselves. Uncertainty. German soldiers no longer felt comfortable moving through open spaces. Every exposed step suddenly carried the possibility of another unseen shot. Commanders hesitated before ordering advances across small clearings. Units paused to regroup. The confidence that had defined the encirclement earlier in the morning began to fade. Inside the American perimeter, the mood slowly shifted as well. The men who had expected a desperate last stand were now watching the enemy behave differently. The pressure that had seemed overwhelming hours earlier was no longer tightening. In fact, in some directions, the German movement had nearly stopped. The rifleman continued his patient work. One shot. Then quiet. Another shot, long minutes later. Each round reinforced the same unsettling message to the surrounding troops. You are not as safe as you think. By late afternoon, the German perimeter had begun to loosen. Some units pulled back deeper into the trees, attempting to locate the mysterious shooter or reorganize their approach. But the momentum of the encirclement was already broken. What had begun that morning as a confident siege was slowly unraveling into hesitation and confusion. And at the center of it all, behind a snow-covered fallen tree, one patient rifleman kept watching the forest through his scope. By the time the pale winter sun began dropping behind the frozen trees of the Ardennes, the battlefield looked very different from the desperate situation that had existed that morning. Hours earlier, 40 American soldiers had believed they were facing their final stand. 300 German troops had surrounded them. The outcome had seemed obvious. But now the forest had grown strangely quiet. German movement had slowed across the surrounding tree lines. In several directions, entire groups of soldiers had pulled back deeper into the woods, trying to reorganize and understand what had gone wrong. Inside the American position, the men slowly began lifting their heads from behind logs and shallow foxholes. They listened carefully. The forest no longer sounded like an army closing in. Instead, it sounded like an army hesitating. Then, sometime in the late afternoon, a new sound appeared in the distance. Engines. American reinforcements moving through the forest roads. Word of scattered patrols and unexpected German advances had spread quickly through the sector, and nearby American units had begun pushing forward to stabilize the line. When the first reinforcements finally reached the area, they expected to find what most soldiers would assume in such a situation: a destroyed patrol. Or prisoners. Instead, they found something almost unbelievable. 40 exhausted soldiers still holding their position along the tree line. Alive. Cold. Low on ammunition. But still standing. As the situation stabilized and units began reorganizing the defensive line, soldiers started piecing together what had happened throughout the long winter day. One detail kept appearing in every version of the story: the rifleman. Several soldiers described hearing the same pattern of fire for hours. Not bursts. Not panic. Just one rifle shot at a time. Then silence. Then another shot minutes later. One of the patrol members pointed toward a fallen tree where a quiet soldier was finally sitting up after spending most of the day lying in the snow. His rifle rested across his knees. The scope was still fogged slightly from the cold air. For nearly 6 hours, he had barely moved. During that time, according to the men who had watched the forest carefully, German soldiers positioned at what they believed were safe distances had begun dropping one by one. No one knew the exact number. Some said a dozen. Others believed it was far more. But the true impact had never been just the casualties. It had been the uncertainty. The Germans had expected an easy encirclement. Instead, every time one of their soldiers stepped into open ground, another precise shot reminded them that distance did not guarantee safety. And slowly, that realization had changed their behavior. They hesitated. They slowed. They pulled back. In war, momentum can be everything. And that day in the Ardennes Forest, the momentum had quietly shifted. Not because of artillery. Not because of tanks. But because one soldier understood something many others forgot in the chaos of battle. Patience can be a weapon. Long before the war, in the mountains of Montana, a hunter had learned to wait for hours just to take a single shot at an elk moving across a distant valley. In those mountains, rushing meant failure. In that forest in Belgium, rushing might have meant 40 dead soldiers. Instead, one rifleman brought the patience of the mountains to the battlefield. And in a war dominated by massive armies, roaring engines, and exploding artillery, one quiet rifle, fired slowly, carefully, and with absolute precision, had changed the outcome of an entire encounter.